Hi, my name's Eric Rye, like the kind of bread. I'm a third-year PhD student and probably the oldest PhD student at the University of Maryland. I am typically like a network security and privacy kind of guy. Anything on the internet that's like sort of sad is where I'm typically at. So with that as an intro, let's talk about Wi-Fi positioning systems, or WPSs for short. At a high level, a Wi-Fi positioning system is just a system that somebody runs to allow mobile devices to geolocate themselves using Wi-Fi routers as landmarks. And while I'm going to focus exclusively on Apple's Wi-Fi positioning system during this talk, I just want to make clear at the outset that Google, Microsoft, some other companies like Skyhook, all operate Wi-Fi positioning systems. But the way that Apple's is implemented has some kind of unique quirks that make it uniquely vulnerable to the type of attacks that I'll be talking about. So let's get right into what a Wi-Fi positioning system is and how it works. So imagine that this is your house with this like enormous router outside your front door. And that router is like constantly advertising its presence by sending out certain types of 802.11 management frames that indicate what the network name is so that it shows up in your Wi-Fi settings. But importantly, those broadcasts are also containing a unique identifier for that access point. In fact, for that interface, an interface on that access point called a basic service set identifier, or BSSID for short. And a BSSID is essentially just the MAC address of an interface on that Wi-Fi access point. And from time to time, if we're talking exclusively about Apple here, so from time to time, if someone with an iPhone happens to be nearby your Wi-Fi access point and they happen to have access to high-quality geolocation information because they're using a map application, or maybe because the operating system just happened to pull the GPS daemon, from time to time, they'll take note of that Wi-Fi BSSID, that access point's BSSID, their own location, and they'll ship that off to Apple. Essentially what Apple is doing here, or any of the other Wi-Fi positioning system operators, what they're doing here is they're creating this worldwide database of where all the BSSIDs are on planet Earth, as we'll see later here. And the reason that they're doing that is because later, some other devices in their ecosystem might want to geolocate themselves, but might not want to use GPS. Now, there's several reasons this might happen. GPS requires higher power than just scanning the 802.11 spectrum. Some devices don't have GPS. Like my MacBook, for instance, doesn't have a GPS interface. And maybe you're inside. Maybe you're in an urban canyon. There's lots of reasons why you might not be able to use GPS, but still need to know where you are. And so the way devices use the WPS to do that is they simply sample the 802.11 channels, and they take note of the BSSIDs that they overhear, and they ship those off to, in this case, Apple. And what Apple does, if it knows about that BSSID that we've asked it about, it will respond with that BSSID's geolocation. But the way that Apple's works, the unique kind of quirk in Apple's implementation of a Wi-Fi positioning system, is that in addition to the BSSID that you've requested in its location, it also returns up to 400 additional BSSIDs that are nearby that BSSID that you asked about that are unrequested, and their geolocations as well. And it ships those back to you. Your phone then does some fancy math to figure out where it's at, trilateration, using received signal strengths from those BSSIDs that Apple's told you about, and voila, the phone knows where it is now. It's objectively like a pretty cool system, right? You can use nearby Wi-Fi access points to figure out where you are without having to use GPS. Pretty neat. So just to recap how Apple's Wi-Fi positioning system works in particular, when you request a BSSID's geolocation from it, it returns that BSSID's geolocation if it knows where it is, and up to 400 additional unrequested BSSIDs that happen to be nearby, just to give you a lot of landmarks to use to figure out where you're at. I just want to make clear here that this tracks the location of all access points. So you might be like, well, I'm not an Apple owner. I don't care. My Wi-Fi access point isn't in this system. And indeed, it almost certainly is, right? Just living next to somebody that owns an iPhone, having a UPS man that has an iPhone, having somebody who walks their dog outside of your house that has an iPhone will almost certainly make your Wi-Fi access point end up in this system. Prior to our paper, which my advisor and I published at IEEE Security and Privacy earlier this year, there was no publicly known way to opt out of this. All of this is exposed via an unauthenticated, publicly accessible API with no rate limit. So, there's a pretty low-power attacker here, right? It's basically anybody on the internet that can send an HTTPS request. And as we'll find out shortly, this permits, as you can imagine, a variety of attacks by a very low-power attacker. I just want to kind of put this talk in context to other Black Hat talks, because this is not the first talk that's used Wi-Fi positioning systems to great effect. In fact, over a decade ago, there was a Black Hat Arsenal talk called iSniff GPS, which essentially just used like Kismet to pump BSSIDs into Apple's WPS to map identifiers that were nearby. My colleague and I had a talk at Black Hat 21 about geolocating specific kinds of IPv6 addresses that have MAC addresses embedded in the lower 64 bits, called IPv4. And then finally, this talk is like the third and kind of a line here of ways that the Apple's Wi-Fi positioning system can be used by attackers. And we'll talk about how we can enumerate Apple's WPS data and do some interesting longitudinal analyses starting right now. So the first kind of research question that I had is, how much information can we learn from Apple's Wi-Fi positioning system? And in order to talk about that, first we have to talk about MAC addresses, which I deeply enjoy, but I know some people may not, so I'll make it quick. MAC addresses are 48-bit hardware identifiers. They're typically burned into ROM, like when that interface is created by the manufacturer. We call the MAC address of an AP, a basic service set identifier, or BSSID. And MAC addresses have a particular structure to them. The upper 3 bytes of a MAC address is called the Organizational Unique Identifier, or OUI. And OUI is assigned by the IEEE to a manufacturer of 802.11 interfaces. They go to the IEEE, they say, hey, I want to make some Wi-Fi chips. And the IEEE says, cool, here's your OUI. There's a many-to-one relationship here, so folks like Cisco and Apple have many OUIs that are assigned to them. So knowing what we know now about MAC addresses, we can already see kind of a naive attack on Apple's Wi-Fi positioning system. They're 48-bit identifiers, so you can just start guessing 48-bit numbers, right? So you just start slinging random BSSIDs at Apple, and Apple is going to be like, nah, I don't know where those are, probably, because 48 bits is a lot of bits. And just guessing random numbers is not a great strategy if you want to accumulate large amounts of data from the WPS. There's over 280 trillion unique possible BSSIDs, so you might have some success. Maybe you're luckier than I am every once in a while, but in large part, you're going to be unsuccessful when you just guess random BSSIDs. So the next research question was, can we improve our guessing odds here? And indeed we can. So recall that an OUI is the upper 3 bytes of a MAC address, and the IEEE allocates OUIs to vendors. But only 36,000 of the possible 16 million OUIs actually have been assigned by the IEEE. And as chance would have it, the IEEE publishes that list of OUIs for free on the internet for anyone to download. And so the solution here is to just start guessing random BSSIDs from within those 36,000 allocated OUIs by the IEEE. That's an over 99% reduction in the search space, and you don't have to be Einstein to figure out that that's like a pretty good deal, right? So instead of just guessing random BSSIDs, we start guessing random BSSIDs that are within an allocated assigned by the IEEE OUI. And in practice, you're still going to guess wrong a lot of the time. But every now and again, you're going to happen to hit on a random BSSID from within an allocated OUI that Apple knows about. And when you do that, you get those additional up to 400 BSSIDs along with it. So by doing this intelligent kind of OUI-based random guessing, you end up having a lot better success. How good of success? I'm glad you asked. So we conducted an experiment in which we just guessed a couple thousand random BSSIDs within each of the allocated OUIs. And in fact, those extra 400 BSSIDs that you get back provide an incredible return on investment. The vast majority, I want to point out here that the y-axis is log scale, the vast majority of the information that you can pull out of the Wi-Fi positioning system is these additional BSSIDs that just happen to be returned with the ones that you've randomly guessed. Remember, this is like an Apple-specific quirk. So after a day of just random guessing, we had accumulated more than 100 million unique BSSIDs in their geolocations. And after a couple of days, we'd accumulated over 500 million. Where are those BSSIDs is the next logical question that you might ask. And as it turns out, they're like mostly where people are on planet Earth. As you kind of look at the places you might call home, like the US is pretty bright red, as is Western Europe, South America. You can start to see places where people don't live, right? The Amazon rainforest or the Sahara Desert. But one thing that was particularly confusing and interesting to us at the outset of this was, where are all the BSSIDs in China? We were finding some of them, but not as many as we expected to, since China has a population of over 1 billion. And after our initial research paper came out, we sort of spawned a cottage industry of people that were interested in looking at this data. And I have to give credit to those folks down there at the bottom who discovered that Apple just has a China-specific Wi-Fi positioning system that's located at a different HTTPS endpoint. It's just a different URL. It works in exactly the same way, and if you query that Wi-Fi positioning system, you can extract all these BSSIDs from China as well. And importantly, while this is a China-specific Wi-Fi positioning system that Apple runs, it's globally queryable, so you can hit it here from Las Vegas if you'd like. So people often ask, like, how do I know that you're just not hitting all the Wi-Fi in major cities? You know, what if someone's in a remote location? What if they're in Antarctica? And I said, yeah, what if they are in Antarctica? And so I looked for BSIDs that were, at particularly low latitudes. And all of these labels on Antarctica here are research stations on Antarctica where I have BSSID geolocations. So even in places where there's only a couple of dozen people living, Apple's Wi-Fi positioning system captures that information as well. Pretty cool. All right, so now I want to get into a couple of attacks that, knowing how Apple's Wi-Fi positioning system works and knowing how you can extract massive amounts of data from it in a pretty easy fashion, what kind of attacks can we mount here? And sort of the simplest, smoothest brain one that you might concoct is, let's say that I'm, a law enforcement official, or, somebody's in a, intimate partner violence situation or something like that, and somebody wants to track a specific Wi-Fi access point over time. They know what that BSSID is a priori, and let's say that person moves. They, pick up and leave. They abscond. Well, that attacker can simply query Apple's Wi-Fi positioning system for that BSSID continuously until it pops up in some other location. And voila, now you know where that access point is. That's sort of the most basic kind of attack that you might mount knowing how a Wi-Fi positioning system works, because BSSIDs are persistent identifiers. But wait, there's more. What if, instead of just targeting one specific individual whose BSSID you know, what if you want to mount kind of larger scale mass surveillance attacks by using all of that Wi-Fi data that you've ingested? And there's a couple of different threat models that I'll describe here. So the first is the simpler of the two. As we know, an organizationally unique identifier identifies the manufacturer of a device. It's possible, because an OUI has 16 million BSSIDs that are inside of that OUI, to enumerate every single BSSID for an OUI in just a matter of hours. It's pretty easy. You just make a lot of requests. And so this allows us to trivially geolocate all of the devices within an OUI in the span of a day. And so for many OUIs, who cares? Like Cisco systems, everybody has a Cisco device, right? My doctor, my school, this place probably does. But what if that OUI tells you something that's interesting or privacy sensitive about the kind of device that has that MAC address, like Starlink, right? Starlink uses this Tibro OUI. Tibro is orbit backwards. If we could do something like geolocate all the Starlink routers in Ukraine, that would be particularly scary and bad, right? And so here's a picture of all the Starlink routers in Ukraine. Yeah, whoa is right. Some of the things that kind of pop out at me initially are, there's some hotspots in major cities like Kyiv. That's, fairly unsurprising. Got a lot of people there. You're going to have a lot of Starlinks probably. More interesting, or you can kind of make out the contours of the front lines of their war with Russia and the eastern side of Ukraine, which is where the Donbas is, and then as you kind of go to the southeast, where Crimea is down there at the bottom, this is where the front lines in the war with Russia and Ukraine are, and you can kind of see how far east they go to see how far where the front lines are. And then finally, there's been some discussion about whether Starlink routers are operating in Russian-occupied territory, and we do see at least one instance of a Starlink router popping up in Russian-occupied Crimea. The second kind of threat deals with device mobility. So, while my access point at home looks like this WRT54G that's accumulating a thick sheen of dust, many people end up taking their Wi-Fi access points with them, like this Starlink router there, or there's a whole slew of travel routers that people try to sell that are designed for you to take with you on vacation or in your RV or on your boat or whatever it may be. And so the next research question was how much do Wi-Fi routers move? And so what we did was we took a 10 million BSSID sample from that initial 500 million, and we just queried Apple's Wi-Fi positioning system every day over the course of a month to see how much of them moved. We set kind of a minimum threshold of 1 kilometer as like a threshold to call something a mover or not. And indeed, most Wi-Fi access points don't move very much. Only 6,000 of those 10 million moved more than a kilometer. And when they moved, they didn't really move all that far. Kind of the median distance traveled was between 5 and 10 kilometers, so moving within a city or something like that. But when we filtered those routers, when we looked at from our whole data set for routers that belong to vendors like GeoINet that make travel routers, we saw that a lot of them move, many of them move, and when they do move, they move quite a bit further. So then again, we took a look at some interesting case studies where devices move. So we drew kind of a geo box around the Donbas region in Ukraine and also in Crimea, like where the war is actively happening. And we looked at where devices were before they popped up in one of those locations. And so you can kind of make out some interesting things here, right? And there's a couple of hotspots from top to bottom. I think that's St. Petersburg, Moscow, Rostov-on-Don, and Krasnodar, which are big cities in Russia. So it's possible this is like where pre-deployment sites are, where Russian soldiers are going before they go to war and they're testing their devices out, that kind of thing. Other interesting bits that you can take out of here are like there's a lot of dots in Western Europe. Who are those people? And I don't have ground truth here. We didn't go looking to dox anybody, but these are possibly NGO workers, or Ukrainian Foreign Legion folks, or potentially volunteers on the Russian side. I don't know. Then we looked at what happens when devices just like disappear from Apple's Wi-Fi positioning system. So that snapshot on the left is all of the BSSIDs, about 300,000 BSSIDs in the Gaza Strip about a week after the October 7th Hamas attacks. And then the snapshot in the middle is the BSSIDs, the same BSSIDs about a month later. And we saw about a 75% decrease in the number of BSSIDs that were in Apple's Wi-Fi positioning system of that original set. So what that means is that lots of these routers are just no longer geolocatable. In between these two snapshots, Israel cut power to Gaza, and they also commenced their ground war. And so likely what you're seeing here is a lot of routers that went offline because they don't have power or were just destroyed. So this seems pretty bad to me, and so obviously we wanted to tell Apple and folks to try to fix this and make this right. And so this is kind of our disclosure timeline. We disclosed to Apple in December of last year. And the other question that we had is like, who do you even disclose this to? And this affects like every router on Earth, right? Who do you tell? And so we told GeoINet and SpaceX, because these are two router manufacturers that feature prominently in both our paper and obviously this talk as well. So Apple reached back out to us in March and informed us that they had added some text to their location services privacy page that informs users of how they can opt out of having their BSSIDs be in Apple's Wi-Fi positioning system. And you do that by simply adding an _nomap to the end of your network name, your SSID, and this will cause Apple to remove you. You no longer have your BSSIDs in its system. We suggested some other potential remediations, like limit the number of queries that you get from a particular IP address, require authentication, or limit the amount of additional information that you give back when someone sends a BSSID that the Wi-Fi positioning system knows about. This extra 400, maybe limit that to 5 or 10. But as of today, Apple has not implemented any of those remediations for probably a variety of factors, but I'd direct you to them for additional comment on that. Our remediation for Wi-Fi vendors, our recommendation for remediation to Wi-Fi router vendors was to randomize their BSSIDs. So randomizing your basic service set identifiers, the MAC addresses that are actually used when that router powers on and starts advertising, will prevent all of the attacks that I talked about earlier. By randomizing the BSSID, it prevents that kind of trivial device manufacturer identification, right? You can no longer you can't pick out that that's a Starlink router if it's a random BSSID, for instance. And by changing that random BSSID every time that device powers back on, you prevent the kind of time and space correlation that are possible if that BSSID is persistent, right? So by requiring the devices to use a random BSSID and to change that BSSID every time they power back on, this will prevent the attacks that I outlined in this talk. And thankfully, and to their great credit, when I reached out to the folks at the SpaceX product security team, they informed me that they actually started doing that in the middle of our study. However, they were focused on specific types of devices, like the main Starlink router, and they were focused on specific regions of the world. I'll leave it to the imagination where they were, implementing this initially. But when I reached out to them and I showed them, our analysis and the number of SpaceX or Starlink devices that we could geolocate, they said, "Yep, let's just do this everywhere for all the products. It's, all the main routers and all the Wi-Fi extenders, all of their products randomize their BSSIDs." And as you can kind of see there on the far right, there's no longer any of those Starlink OUI devices that you can find in Apple's Wi-Fi positioning system anymore. So this is like a good effort by their product security team that I think will help the users of Starlink devices. GeoINet, which makes these small form factors, that Mango router is like that small, which makes these kind of travel routers. They initially told us that they didn't have any plans to randomize the BSSIDs. We got a little bit of press after our initial academic paper came out, and I think that helped them change their mind. And I'm happy to say that as of a couple of weeks ago, GeoINet is now in their latest software version randomizing their BSSIDs as well. So that concludes my talk. Just to kind of put a bow on things, I'll just summarize. We discovered a large-scale privacy vulnerability in how Apple's Wi-Fi positioning system works. Right? It's an unauthenticated, globally accessible HTTPS endpoint that simply accepts queries of BSSIDs, and if you send it a known BSSID, it will return a whole bunch of additional information. Having that additional information will allow you, A, to expand that corpus of Wi-Fi geolocation data in a very quick way. Like I said earlier, we were able to build up a corpus of about 500 million BSSIDs in under a week, and their geolocations in under a week. And if you continue to geolocate those same devices, you'll be able to do things like track those devices longitudinally as they move around. If you want to try this out yourself, there is some sample code on my GitHub that simply accepts a BSSID as a command line parameter, and will show you the geolocation of that BSSID as well as the additional information that's returned. So that concludes my talk. I'm happy to take some questions as we have time, and yeah, thanks. Oh, I was told to tell you that there's microphones there, and there too.
Question for you. Awesome talk, by the way.
Thanks.
Super rad. With the data that you're collecting, have you found any value in cross-pollinating with other sources like wiggle.net or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So actually, I mentioned that this is the second work that I've had that uses Apple Wi-Fi positioning system data. I had originally tried to use Weigel because I knew of Weigel. Everyone knows of Weigel. They're a great resource, but Weigel has a fairly substantial rate limit, and the amount of information that you can get out of Weigel is fairly low, which is why I turned to Apple's Wi-Fi positioning system. I have done some determining whether the geolocations that I was getting for a BSSID were close to Weigel's, and indeed in 99% of the cases they were pretty close. The thing with Weigel is the war driver may have stumbled upon your BSSID 6 months ago or whatever, right? Whereas this updates once a day typically. Yeah, we'll go there, sure.
Hi, first of all, congratulations on the talk, and I also want to congratulate you on your efforts to disclose responsibly. Let me preface this by saying I'm a lawyer who's for 25 years has been teaching legal and regulatory aspects of cyber at Royal Holloway in London.
Uh-oh.
So my question to you is this. In your disclosure plan, did anyone ever consider disclosing what you found to Max Schrems in Europe so that he could use the information that you've collected to persuade information commissioners around Europe that BSSIDs are personal data and that the actions taken by Apple and others should be regulated as such?
I'm going to show my ignorance here, and I don't know who or what that is, but...
Max Schrems is a who. He was a law student who sued Facebook more than once and
I see.
Ended up voiding the Privacy Shield arrangements with Europe twice.
I think that my response probably answers your question, and that no, I did not. But certainly interested to talk to you after in the wrap room or something if you'd like.
I guess broadly speaking, just to follow up, did it, a little closer to home, when you looked at the ethical, when you did the ethical review for your project, to what extent were you challenged, or to what extent did you have to answer questions about potential impact on individual data subjects, individual living human beings, the data you were collecting?
Right. I mean, we went through the standard sort of institutional review board stuff, process that you go through at most major American universities that, asked us questions about, is this person identifiable information, that kind of thing, which I don't know that the jury is like out on, has come to a conclusion on that. I mean, I certainly think that you can make a case that, based on seeing people's BSSIDs moving from their house to other locations, I mean, in many cases that might uniquely identify them, yeah.
Thank you, good work.
Yeah, thank you, thanks. I don't know who's next, so someone should just start talking and I'll look that way.
So how effective would this be for things like mobile hotspots?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because I even anticipated this question. Right. This is sort of answers your question. Devices that move around a lot do not end up in this positioning, in the Wi-Fi positioning system. There's a couple reasons for that, right? They're going to get observed at a bunch of different locations, and Apple's going to know, or whoever the Wi-Fi positioning system operator is going to know, that this is not a stable landmark. It has to be stable for, at least in my kind of empirical testing at my house, that the device has to be stable for a period of at least 3 days and maybe up to a week before it actually shows up. And then the same thing is true on the backside of things. So if I unplug my router and then I just query the system every day for about a week, it will disappear somewhere in there after a couple of days. Yeah, because it's asking, it's waiting to see if other devices report that device is there, right? I mean, it's all based on whether, an iPhone says that my router is there, and if it only decides to take it out after it's, not been reported for a while. Yeah, what's up?
We have time for one more question.
I'm just curious if you know what are potential side effects of opting out of Apple's WSB, because I'm thinking about doing it myself, but I don't want to break anything that I might need in the future.
Yeah, I don't think that a lot of people are going to, because it requires you to scroll to 7/8 of the way down a huge page to find that information on Apple's location services privacy page, which you wouldn't be at unless you were looking for this kind of information. I guess the one thing that I would say is that it identifies you as someone who's privacy conscious or maybe sensitive. So that could be interesting for people just looking at your SSID, but I mean, if everybody opted out of this, obviously the system wouldn't work, right? But I just don't think they're going to see opts out in those kind of numbers that it would affect the actual performance of the system, would be my guess, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.